All right, today we're jumping into something pretty intense. It's an idea that ties together ancient religion, modern conflict, and, well, the deep-seated human needs that connect them. It all comes together under this title, Fish, Barrels, and Warheads.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The whole thing kicks off with this really powerful metaphor. You've probably heard a version of it. The idea that critiquing these ancient desert religions is like shooting fish in a barrel. It feels almost too easy, right? But the argument we're looking at today says, yeah, the fish are real and the barrel is definitely there. The really important part, though, is what happens after the shot is fired.
So that brings us to our first section, shooting fish in a barrel. We're going to dig into why that saying feels so accurate. I mean, we're talking about the most obvious and, frankly, often the most disturbing problems you run into when you just read the source material itself.
Okay, so on the one hand, the claim is that these books are basically a perfect, divinely inspired user manual for how to be human. But then you look at the reality, and they're just full of problems. I mean, just think about the story in Exodus. You have an all-knowing God who, for some reason, needs people to paint blood on their doors so he knows which houses to skip when he's killing babies. The logic doesn't hold up. It's a huge internal contradiction that's really hard to just brush aside.
And it's not like the violence is just some random one-off thing. It's baked right into the structure of the stories. We're talking about the big ones, the foundational myths, Passover, the Great Flood, the command to wipe out the Amalekites. The argument here is that these aren't bugs, they're not misinterpretations, they're features. Someone, at some point, made a conscious choice to include these stories in what they called a holy book.
So what happens? Well, it pushes believers into this mode of what you could call theological damage control. It's like a whole series of mental gymnastics to try and make the really indefensible parts make sense. You hear things like, oh, it's just an allegory, or you have to understand the context, or that was the old covenant. But really, each one of those is just a fancy way of saying, well, it doesn't actually mean what it clearly says. It's all about trying to keep the whole thing morally coherent.
And really, it all boils down to this, right? If the instruction manual for your worldview is so complicated that you need a PhD in ancient literature just to use it without hurting people, then it's not a very good instruction manual, is it? It's actually a liability. The book itself isn't doing the heavy lifting, morally speaking. The reader is. They're the one bringing the morality, and the book is just sort of providing cover.
Okay, so let's move on. Because this whole thing goes way beyond just some dusty academic debate about old books. Remember that barrel we were talking about? Well, here's the twist. The barrel isn't some abstract idea. The barrel is the world we live in right now.
And this is where it all stops being a game. You look at something like the Strait of Hormuz, that's not an ancient problem. The conflicts there are directly tied to global shipping lanes, the price you pay for gas, the stability of the entire world. This stuff isn't ancient history. It is literally today's news. So what you're seeing in that crucial part of the world is basically ancient software, ancient ideas and grievances running on brand new 21st century hardware. We're talking about the Sunni-Shia split that's 1,400 years old. Ancient tensions between Persians and Arabs, these are old wounds. But the weapons, the global economic fallout, that stuff is as modern as it gets. And this gets to the absolute core of it. The through line that connects the violence in those old books to the crises we see today is this one simple, powerful, and dangerous idea: tribalism. The belief that my God, my people, our story, it just matters more than yours. And that yours, it doesn't even really count. Of course, nobody thinks of themselves as a tribalist. No, tribalism always feels like righteousness from the inside.
All right, so this is where we really get to the heart of the argument. And honestly, it's pretty terrifying when you think about it. Because the mindset, that tribal way of thinking, it might be ancient. But the level of danger, oh, that has changed dramatically.
I mean, look at this. This is a direct quote, a command from the source material. My God commands me to dash your babies against rocks. It's just pure, uncut, Bronze Age tribal brutality. It's horrifying, it's personal, it's visceral.
But here's the thing. As absolutely horrific as that is, it's what the source material calls a bounded atrocity. You know, there's a limit to the damage one person can do with rocks. Armies get tired. But warheads? That's not just an upgrade. It's an entirely different category of problem, one with potentially civilization-ending consequences.
So the power to kill, our lethality ceiling has gone up by, 1 millionfold. But the psychology underneath it all, that us versus them tribal thinking, it hasn't budged, not one bit. And what does that leave us with? A Bronze Age mindset with its hands on nuclear hardware. That's a terrifying thought.
But why? Why do we even build these kinds of tribal frameworks to begin with? To get at that, we've got to zoom way out, past all the geopolitics, and look at something much more fundamental, something at the deepest human level.
The argument is that deep down, at our core, we're all just asking a few simple, childlike questions. The first one is maybe the most basic. Is anyone in charge here? You look out at all the chaos in the world, and there's this profound, desperate need to believe that somebody, somewhere, has a plan.
And then the next question gets even more personal. Does anyone even see me? We just crave that feeling of being seen, of being recognized, that sense that our lives, our pain and our joys, are actually being witnessed by something bigger than us.
And then there's the last one, and maybe this is the most fundamental of all. If something truly terrible happens, is anyone going to come help? It's that raw need for a protector, that desperate hope that when things fall apart, we're not completely alone. It's the need for a parent.
But what's the most consistent piece of data we have? You look across thousands of years of human history, at all the suffering, all the atrocities committed in the name of some god, and what does the universe give back? Silence. The conclusion from this line of thinking is pretty stark. The problem isn't that we're godless, it's that we're parentless.
So, if that's true, if no one's coming to rescue us, then what are we supposed to do? That brings us to our final section. It's about this idea of orphans building something worthy. This is about the great unfinished project of our time.
Critiquing these old traditions, as satisfying as it can be, that's the easy part. Tearing things down is always simpler. The real work, the hard, urgent work, is in designing and building what comes next. What could possibly be strong enough to hold all of our human needs once those old stories don't work anymore?
So that's the challenge, right? How do we build new frameworks that give us what we need? Things like solidarity and community, a foundation for meaning, a way to handle suffering, a way to hold powerful people accountable. How do we do all of that, but without the baby killing and the tribalism? The idea here is that it's about learning how to parent ourselves together.
And this suggests a pretty radical shift in thinking. What if, instead of trying to build our communities on the idea of a shared imaginary parent, what if we built it on our shared orphanhood? What if that clear-eyed, sober recognition that, hey, we are all in this big, parentless house together? What if that's the only truly honest foundation for a global community?
And that's where this whole exploration leaves us. There's no neat and tidy answer here, just a really urgent, open-ended question. The rocks have turned into warheads, that old tribal mindset is still with us, and the universe is still silent. So the question is, can a species that finally understands it's on its own still build something worthy of survival? That, right there, is the unfinished project of our time.
Usually when we talk about upgrading our tech, there's this baseline expectation of progress, right? Like you buy a new phone, and the software just updates automatically to match the new hardware.
Right. It's supposed to be a completely seamless transition.
Exactly. But, okay, imagine taking this ancient, just incredibly buggy, highly aggressive piece of software. Something designed thousands of years ago just to help a small tribe survive in the desert.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And then you take that and you forcefully install it onto a global network of nuclear weapons.
Well, the system architecture would just immediately buckle under that. You wouldn't just be looking at a glitch, you'd be looking at an existential threat.
And that terrifying mismatch, that's actually the core focus of our deep dive today. We are opening up this profoundly intense philosophical document. It's titled Fission Parenting.
It's quite a title and a fascinating read.
It really is. It takes on everything from, the psychology of ancient religious texts to modern geopolitics. And what's wild about this text is that it just completely torches both sides of the aisle.
Oh, absolutely. Nobody is safe in this piece.
Right. It goes after conservative fundamentalism with a hammer, but it is just as brutal toward progressive religion and secular politics. And just as a quick disclaimer for you listening, we are strictly exploring the architecture of the arguments today.
Yeah, we're looking at the mechanics of it all.
Exactly, the mechanics of the ideas. We are not taking a side on the existence of God or championing any specific political movement here. We're just impartially unpacking what the author is arguing.
Because the author is essentially holding up a mirror to the entire human project And I gotta say, the reflection is pretty uncomfortable.
So it starts by looking at traditional atheist critiques of ancient texts. It brings up that phrase, shooting fish in a barrel.
Right. The author talks about writers like Christopher Hitchens, pointing out that when they look at ancient desert religions, the moral critique is almost too easy.
Yeah, like tearing down the morality of those ancient stories, it doesn't take heavy philosophical lifting. The atrocity is just sitting right there on the page.
Exactly. Think about the biblical Exodus narrative, for example, where Egyptian firstborn children are killed.
Right.
The source argues that critics like Hitchens, they successfully shoot the fish, but they fundamentally misunderstand the situation because they leave the barrel intact.
Okay, let's unpack this. What does leaving the barrel intact actually mean in this context?
Well, it means they treat the violence as if it's just this tragic flaw, or maybe a primitive misunderstanding of the divine.
Like a glitch in the code.
Exactly. But the source emphasizes that the violence in these ancient texts is not a bug, it isn't an anomaly, and it isn't a misinterpretation. It is baked completely into the structural architecture of the theology.
So we're talking about a structural divine infanticide count.
Yes, the text actually lists them out. You've got Passover, the global flood, Jericho, the Amalekites. An ancient editorial hand looked at these stories of absolute devastation, compiled them, and decided, yeah, this belongs in our sacred text. This is what our God is actually like.
Wow. So the retention of the violence is the actual indictment. It's not just that the ancient world was brutal. I mean, everyone knows it was brutal. It's that the brutality was encoded as divine will.
Right.
So if your entire moral foundation has baby murder as a load-bearing pillar, what do you do with that the morning after you realize it?
You start performing some truly spectacular mental gymnastics. Because the text contains such wild contradictions and structural violence, the text itself stops doing the moral work.
The reader has to step in and do the moral work.
Exactly. The reader steps in, and the book is just utilized to provide cover.
The source brings up a brilliant analogy here, comparing it to a user manual. Let's say you buy a complex machine. If the user manual requires you to have a PhD in hermeneutics, meaning you need an advanced degree in ancient textual interpretation just to operate the machine safely without it exploding in your face, that isn't a user manual anymore.
No, not at all.
It's a massive liability with a leather cover.
And that liability creates the phenomenon of damage control with footnotes.
Damage control with footnotes. I'd love that.
Yeah, you see believers on opposite sides of massive historical ethical issues. Things like debates over slavery, capital punishment, women's rights, all cherry-picking from the exact same book.
And all claiming total fidelity to it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every complex theological workaround you encounter, like someone insisting a violent verse is actually just a beautiful allegory, or arguing intensely about historical context to soften a blow, is ultimately downstream of that liability.
It's the result of someone encountering something indefensible in the text and desperately needing a way to not be defined by it.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is fascinating philosophy, but a lot of people listening are probably wondering, how the 3,000-year-old infanticide story actually impacts your life today.
Because we aren't fighting with chariots anymore.
Right, so why does it matter?
Well, the lethality ceiling has changed drastically, but the software hasn't. The source argues that these ancient tribal patterns, this desperate need to manage violent texts and define who is inside the tribe and who is outside, they scale up alongside our technology.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Look at the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, right. One of the most critical maritime choke points in the world.
Exactly. When global oil flows are disrupted there, a supply chain manager or a modern economist analyzes it purely through the lens of statecraft, right? Or tariffs, shipping logistics.
Sure.
But the source argues the disruption is fundamentally driven by ancient tribalism.
Okay, I got to push back on that a little bit. Because a lot of political scientists argue that modern wars are never really about religion. Aren't they fundamentally just about resources?
Yeah.
Like oil, land, water, power.
Right, the material fact.
Yeah, the religious stuff is just a convenient costume leaders put on to get 18-year-olds fired up enough to go fight. So give me an example of how religion actually changes the mechanics of a war.
Well, material resources are always factors, certainly. But you can sit down at a table and negotiate over a water right or a specific border. That kind of dispute is transactional.
Yeah.
Religion does something entirely different. It provides the identity boundaries that make these conflicts durable across centuries. It is nearly impossible to negotiate over cosmic entitlement and divine promise.
Ah, so it changes the nature of the disagreement.
Exactly. Religion is what makes these conflicts sticky.
Sticky, meaning it creates a grudge that doesn't just wash off after a generation or two.
Yeah, it creates a grudge that lasts 1,400 years, like the Sunni and Shia split,
Mm.
or the Persian and Arab tensions that are even older,
Wow.
or the mythological roots of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, which draw directly on those Exodus-era narratives and are being actively deployed in military decisions today.
The source quotes the philosopher Peter Wessel Zaff here, and I feel like it frames this terrifying reality perfectly.
Yeah.
Zaff suggested humanity might just be a biological mistake.
It's a chilling concept. He proposed that human consciousness over-evolved. We became conscious enough to deeply understand our tragic situation in the universe, but we are not sophisticated enough to actually manage it wisely.
It's like installing a supercomputer into a golf cart. The engine just tears itself apart trying to process all that incoming data. So we have this Bronze Age tribal epistemology, this ancient, fear-based way of knowing the world.
Running on nuclear hardware.
Exactly. We literally built the world-ending weapons before we outgrew the myths that justify using them.
The rocks versus nukes gap is the entire problem distilled into one sentence. The difference between "my God commands me to dash your babies against rocks" and "my God commands me to nuke your nation" is only the hardware.
Because the underlying psychology hasn't changed.
Right. The foundational belief that my God, my people, and our story matter and yours fundamentally do not count the same, that hasn't moved a single inch since the Bronze Age.
So if this literal interpretation of the text is practically a nuclear hazard, why don't we just walk away from the barrel? Why do humans cling to this tribal psychology so fiercely?
The source makes a profound turn here. It argues that this clinging isn't about stupidity, and it isn't about ignorance. It is a massive trauma response to a profound absence.
And to explain that absence, they bring in a concept from Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah, specifically a character named Ivan Karamazov who talks about returning the ticket. Ivan looks at the horrific, unspeakable suffering of innocent children throughout history,
Right.
and he argues that if God authorized these atrocities, if innocent suffering is simply the price of admission for some grand divine harmony at the end of time, then the word good loses all meaning entirely.
He isn't just saying he doesn't believe in God. He is saying, even if you exist, I refuse to accept your terms. I am returning my ticket to this universe.
He refuses the underlying morality of the system. And the source uses Ivan's stance to highlight the core trauma of human consciousness, which is the absolute silence of God during horrific human-on-human suffering.
Because throughout history, the sky has remained agonizingly quiet while terrible things happen. And since humans are meaning-making creatures, we just cannot bear that crushing silence.
So we invent a solution.
We invent a celestial CEO, or a cosmic parent, right? Just to make the silence feel intentional rather than empty. The text makes this incredible distinction that really stuck with me.
The part about orphans.
Yeah, that we are not a godless species. We are a parentless species. We are orphans.
And that orphan cytology operates in some incredibly destructive ways in the real world, particularly when we look at apocalyptic theology.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because this part of the text completely threw me. It points out that roughly 40% of Americans believe in a desirable, literal apocalypse. 40%.
It's a staggering number.
My immediate thought was, is that just a cynical political strategy to drive voter turnout? Or is it basically a child acting out?
The source leans into that second idea, using an attachment theory metaphor that is so much darker. The author suggests that the apocalyptic death wish, this active desire to see the world end in fire and divine judgment, isn't nihilism. It is deeply rooted in attachment trauma.
Like a severely neglected child who starts breaking things in the house.
Exactly. They aren't breaking things because they hate the house. They're breaking things to force an absent parent to finally show up and pay attention.
Wow. So it's like a kid pulling the fire alarm at school.
Yeah.
They don't actually want the school to burn to the ground. They just want the fire trucks to arrive so they know adults still exist and are actually in charge.
Right.
Millions of people wanting the world to end is basically a planetary scale toddler tantrum.
For these deeply wounded believers, civilizational catastrophe isn't a failure of humanity. It is confirmation that the parent is real. If the world ends, it means someone is finally coming to intervene.
It's the ultimate desperate attempt to end the silence of the sky. But, the source also offers a colder, alternative theory to explain that silence.
Right.
And this gave me absolute chills, the cold researcher theory.
Oh, yeah. Consider the silence of a laboratory. When a researcher designs a maze for a mouse, they introduce the variables, set the parameters, and then they simply stand back and watch with a clipboard.
They don't interfere with the subject mid-run to save it from a mistake. They just record the data.
Exactly. And the terrifying point here is the phenomenology of it, the actual lived experience.
Yeah.
From inside the jar, from our perspective down here in the maze, we cannot tell the difference between a universe with no God at all and a universe with a researcher God who is simply watching to see if we destroy ourselves with our own tools.
So a silent parent who abandoned you feels exactly the same as a scientist who is just taking notes.
Either way, you are left entirely to your own devices. And neither scenario is particularly comforting when you've got your finger hovering over a nuclear button.
Okay, wait. If these literal interpretations are this dangerous, I mean, if they lead to apocalyptic tantrums and tribal warfare, why can't we just update the software, modernize the religion?
Keep the beautiful rituals, keep the community, the feeling of the sacred.
Exactly. Just quietly drop the holy war and the baby killing.
Yeah.
Progressive religion seems like the obvious off-ramp here.
The document is remarkably blunt about progressive religion. It argues that this project is entirely doomed. The source refers to this attempt to modernize as trying to sand off the sharp corners of the fish.
Which is such a great visual.
It calls progressive religion the same fish wearing a hat.
Right, it's just a rebranding exercise.
A rebranding exercise that fails strategically because it keeps people dependent on a mythological framing for their moral motivation. It tells people to still look to the ancient texts for supreme authority, but then it asks them to perform massive intellectual contortions to ignore the bad parts.
Which leaves the next generation with absolutely no epistemological immune system. Let's translate that for a second. It's like raising a kid in a completely sterile bubble, telling them bacteria is just a myth.
And the second they walk outside,
Or in this case, the second they log onto the internet and read the actual unredacted Bronze Age texts, their system completely goes into shock.
the defenses simply aren't there. When they encounter the original text, they usually do one of two things. They either leave the faith entirely because they realize the progressive version was actively hiding the brutal truth of the text, or they capitulate to fundamentalism.
Because fundamentalism is at least intellectually honest about what the text actually demands.
Exactly.
But how does that play out in the secular world, though? Because the source connects this directly to your world as a listener today. It brings up a very modern pressure point, which is people losing their jobs to artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it specifically mentions work VC clients, referring to people navigating employment services after being displaced by technology.
So what happens when the arc of the moral universe meets the reality of AI taking your job? How does getting fired by an algorithm trigger a reversion to Bronze Age theology?
The connection lies in how we handle humiliation and acute stress. The source argues that defanged fish, these modernized, softened versions of religion or even progressive secular humanism, are essentially luxury goods.
Meaning there are wonderful philosophies for comfortable times when you have baseline economic security and social standing.
Right, because the defanged fish just offers nuance and complexity and long-term views about the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice.
Try feeding the arc of the moral universe to someone who just had their entire career rendered obsolete overnight by a string of code.
It doesn't work. When people face real, acute pressure, displacement, economic humiliation, the sudden loss of their identity, they don't want a defanged fish. They don't want nuance. They revert to the original biting fish.
Because when you are terrified and feel completely invisible, you want certainty. You want clear, identifiable enemies.
And a powerful father figure who promises to punish the outgroup that you feel is responsible for your pain. The original fish offers teeth.
It answers the trauma of displacement with the promise of divine retribution and tribal superiority.
Which the source identifies as the actual engine driving modern authoritarian populism around the globe.
Meanwhile, the progressive side just stands by, completely bewildered, pointing to their charts and their sophisticated philosophies.
Because they do not understand that their defanged philosophy has no bite when the lights go out.
So what does this all mean for you? If rebranding the myth doesn't work, and the original myth is going to get us all killed, how do we actually fix this?
The source lays out a monumental task. We have to address the original orphan wound directly. We have to build genuine community, real solidarity, and robust frameworks for bearing suffering that do not rely on drawing tribal boundaries.
We need to figure out how to stand together without requiring a cosmic enemy to unite against. We have to learn, essentially, to parent ourselves.
And developing that kind of collective emotional and moral maturity is daunting. It means learning to bear the silence of the universe without filling it with imaginary, violent fish.
We have to build meaning, not because a celestial CEO is watching us and keeping score, but simply because the children who come after us will need a house that isn't burning down.
Well said.
So whether you are scrolling through the news of geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East, or you're sitting at your desk dealing with your own deep anxieties about AI, job security, and what the future looks like, you are actively witnessing this collision.
You are watching ancient tribal software trying to process modern crises. The challenge of our time isn't just political, it's deeply psychological.
Can we build a world that doesn't need an outgroup to feel secure? Can we finally outgrow the barrel?
Acknowledging the silence is the first step. Choosing to build something worthy within it anyway is the actual work.
I want to leave you with one last lingering thought from the deep dive today. We talked earlier about that terrifying idea of the cold researcher. The concept that God isn't a parent, but a scientist watching humanity to see if we survive our own nuclear technology.
But the source offered an even darker, more provocative possibility right at the very end.
What if the experiment isn't even about us at all? What if humanity, with all our wars, our ancient texts, our desperate prayers, and our technological leaps?
What if we are just the control group?
Exactly. What if we are just the control group? I invite you to sit with that silence for a moment and consider what kind of world you choose to build within it.